of what the weather's like, regardless of what's going on in your individual life, it's good for us to be here together. We're blessed, and just want to acknowledge that. Before I start the message today, I have a little bit of a request. This is the second in a series of 3 messages having to do with the foundations of Christian marriage. Next Sunday, I'm not exactly sure what direction I'll go with that sermon. There are about 3 different themes that I'm thinking about. I've preached on some of these through the years, and I don't preach by vote or consensus, but I'd like to tell you what those 3 themes are. And if you have not just your personal preference, but if you have something you can give me feedback about, this is where I think our church is, this is what I think would be good for us as a body to hear right now, I sure will appreciate that and take that into consideration. One thing I'm thinking about, and we mentioned this last week, last Sunday, foundationally we talked about people come to marriage with unexpected differences. We develop unmet needs, and sometimes we have mistakes and sins that are unforgiven. I didn't go into the need thing, but what I could do next week is to take the whole matter of what does a wife really need? I mean, deeply need in marriage. Guys, what do you have to provide? What do you have to do to make her one happy lady? And what does a husband need? So the whole thing of needs is a possibility. Secondly, this gets a little heavier. One theme I can develop is how to stay faithful in marriage, how to stay off of dead-end streets, how to reject the many communications that are there that could draw us off of loyalty in marriage. The third, and I don't know if this is one that I would do now or not, but I've thought about it. The third would be to preach on a really hard topic, and that would be to examine scriptural teaching on divorce and remarriage. I'd like to do that sometime. There may be a better setting for it, and I'd want to really collaborate with Pastor Richard on that, because if we disagree on any of that, I want to tell you he's right and I'm wrong. So we follow him. But those are 3 themes, and if you want to just whisper to me today as you leave, again, just let me know if you know the church pretty well, you know where you are and you know where others. Which of those themes do you think would be most timely right now for where we are as a people? Okay, that makes sense a little bit. Our Christian faith is only as real and as strong as it shows itself to be in our homes, in our marriages, and in our closest relationships. I mentioned last week that, as far as I know, there's no one chapter or section or book of the Bible that says, here's exactly what Christian marriage is all about. Do this, 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 and this. Actually, there are principles, timeless principles scattered throughout the Scripture. So what we're trying to do in these messages is to pull some of those principles together. And today the theme is really, what makes a marriage good? What makes it good? What building materials do you need to construct a good marriage? I want to say in preaching on marriage in this series, I understand some of the tremendous changes in our society in the last 30, 40, 50 years. I realize that when I speak about marriage and where I'm coming from and what most of us believe, that there are millions of people out there who strongly disagree with me and disagree with you. And I want to tell you that those who disagree and practice differently are not our enemy. They're not. Those who struggle with different sexual orientation, we're not to have negative or hateful or despiteful feelings toward them. In Jesus' name, we're to show compassion and love toward all people. I don't understand some of the positions that people take today. There are a lot of struggles going on. But I'll tell you, as a pastor, especially pastoring for 20 years in a university town, I've been in the trenches with people, individuals and with families, many times with tears and an absolutely broken heart. There's still many, many positions that people take that I cannot fully embrace. But the point is this. On one hand, I want to hold to the biblical concept of marriage. I do that without shame, without apology. I believe there is a Christian foundation that God intends. But on the other hand, those who disagree, and disagree strongly, and take a different track, are not my enemy. I want to show compassion and love as much as I fully can. I have had friends through the years, 2 or 3 really good friends who had different sexual orientation than I do. And I love them. I care about them. I weep for the struggles that goes on. So I just want to let you know that and challenge us that while we stand for truth, we also want to stand for compassion and listening and love. You okay with that? You hear what I'm saying? I hope you hear my heart and not just my words. Here's the message. Good marriages don't just happen. No matter who you marry, a marriage takes some work. And that's what we're looking at today. Let's get to work. I think a key to marriage, and some of you may not agree with this, is not finding the right person. I grew up with that notion. It was sort of communicated that God's will for me is that out of 3 billion women in the world, there's one that God has selected, and I'm just out to find her. Give me a break. 3 billion and just Betty? No. I'm telling you, there are a gob of men in this world that Betty Sue Arnold could have married who would have made her a much better husband than me. And I mean that. What does that matter today? Not one bit. Because my challenge is not in finding the right person. My challenge is in being the right person. Husband or wife. And that's what I want you to hear today. And that's our focus. How do you make it good? How do you let God work in you in such a way that you're becoming a better person? In most instances, now hear me carefully, in most instances, the best person you can be married to is the one you're with right now. There are rare exceptions, but you are probably not one. So don't be one of those people who says, well, we just made a mistake. We're just too different. Our love has died. See, one change in the whole marital scene, when I grew up, a wedding said to love and to comfort till death do us part. But today, not long ago, I was at a wedding where the vow was, as long as our love shall last. We're just too different. Our love has died. Do you know the theological term for that based on the Hebrew word? Baloney. Baloney is what that is. Leave those excuses behind and let's together buckle down and do the sometimes hard, challenging work of building a good, solid, God-honoring marriage. Because I believe this, good marriages are intentional. They take effort. I read something, I'm not a big computer fan, but I came across this week. I don't know who wrote it, but I wrote it down. Marriage isn't about a beautiful wedding, fancy homes, cute kids, nice cars, and a white picket fence. Marriage is hospital stays, working long hours, fighting through struggles, setting up life insurance, paying bills, keeping the faith, and staying together through it all. Now you can say, what a negative view. It's not just negative, that's realistic. Now I want to connect some romance with that as well, but this is the hard work, and the romance is there also. Some people say something like this. Well, if love and romance are in place, why all this talk about working on your marriage? That sounds like drudgery. And keeping your commitments. Commitments? How boring that is. Can't you just fall in love? I want to tell you, I don't believe in falling in love. I don't. Because my experience is that when you fall, you break something. You get hurt. Falling is painful. I believe in growing into love. Gradually getting to know the person, revealing yourself, communicating, being emotionally connected. I want us to grow into love. But we still use the common thing. Some people just say, well, why can't we just fall in love and get married and have a blast forever? Can't every day be Valentine's Day, flowers, chocolates, and Victoria's Secret all the time? That's how love should be. I like romance. I like moonlight and roses. I like whispered secrets from my wife. I like hugs. I like kisses. I like holding hands. Skin on skin feels good because God intended it to, but it's easy to over-romanticize in this area. I believe in romance, but if your marriage is based only or primarily on romance, I'll tell you, and some of you know, that won't cut it for the long haul. There has to be some tightening of the belt and some doing the right thing so you become the right person, making the right choices. Building a good marriage is not unlike building a house. It takes a plan, it takes time, it takes a good attitude, it takes the right tools and materials, it takes a lot of hard work and coordination. It costs more, it takes longer, it makes a bigger mess than you planned on. But building a strong marriage, one that reflects the glory of God, is kind of like building a house, but it's worth the effort. Remember from last week, marriage, biblically, is a metaphor for our relationship with God. Our marriage is intended to reflect Christ's love for His church. And what Jesus desires for His church is what He desires in us. And He wants our marriage to be a shadowed image of who He is and how He works in His people. So I want to just ask you today, and by the way, I hope you got one of these little note sheets as you came in. If you didn't, somebody back there can grab this and give it to you. But I want you to follow this either this morning and take it with you. Because one thing I want you to do today, don't let this just go in one ear and out the other. I'm going to talk about some very common concepts, but I really want you to leave here and say, okay, how does this apply in my marriage or even in some other friendships or relationships? So I want to ask you this. How intentionally, just raise your hand if you need one of these little sheets. How intentionally, how conscientiously are you working to make your marriage relationship better? Another way to say it is, are you drifting or are you building? Are you just letting it happen? I've had people tell me that, oh, Pastor, I'm in love and we're in love and we're just going to let it happen. We're just going to go with the flow. I'm not sure about going with the flow sometimes. So I want to ask, have you ever said to your spouse, whether you've been married 1 year or 40 years or 70 years, have you ever said, honey, let's see if we can make it stronger. Let's see if we can make it better. It's good, but maybe we need some remodeling. Maybe we need an addition onto the house. Have you ever openly evaluated? Have you asked your spouse? Now, I want you to hear this. Have you asked your spouse about their level of marital satisfaction? I may have told you this story before. I don't remember. But I'll tell it again simply because it stands out in my mind as a significant thing embedded in my relationship. Several years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago, we were getting in bed at night, and sometimes we do our best talking when we're in bed. And we were laying there sort of snuggling, and I said, honey, you know how much I love you, but I want to ask you, am I loving you well? She said, what do you mean? I said, Betty, in our marriage, do you feel valued? Do you feel that I respect you? Are you appreciated? Do you feel secure in my love? Am I sensitive to your needs? And there was silence. 30 seconds felt like a month. And I thought, okay, Rouse, you've really stepped in barnyard manure this time. And then I heard her sniffling, and she was crying. I said, honey, what's wrong? What did I say? What's the matter? She said, nothing's wrong, Jerry. She said, honey, that is the sweetest, most wonderful thing you could ever say to me in my life. Now, I'm not saying that's a magical formula, but I'll tell you, then we both cried. And we hugged on to each other, and the bond is so strong and remains that way to this day. Ask him. Ask her. See, God's ideal for our marriage is harmony, intimacy, and unity. Philippians 2 says, live together in harmony and love as though you had only one mind and spirit between you. Now, that applies to the whole body of Christ. That applies to us as a church. But when you apply that to marriage, it becomes more specific and much more intense. Live together in harmony and love as if you just had one mind and spirit between you. Make every effort. Don't go with the flow. Open the toolbox and work at it. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So I want you to, we're going to look at 6 areas. Some of these you've heard before. I want you to evaluate yourself. Please take this seriously. Don't let it just go in one ear and out the other. Make some notes, at least in your mind, when you leave here today or later in the day. Get some time together as husband and wife to think on this. What are the building blocks? What does the work involve? The first one, and you've heard this probably many times, is communication. Proverbs 13:17 says, reliable communication permits progress. Not just the amount of communication, but the spirit of it, the tone of it, the attitude you have. Colossians 4, verse 6, I like this verse. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. I've read that verse many times, and I've often wondered about that little phrase. Let your conversation be full of grace. Well, I understand that a little bit. Seasoned with salt? What in the world does that mean? Some of you know that I'm truly a hillbilly from the Appalachian Mountains of East Tennessee. I grew up in the country. My grandpa had a little hillside farm. We called them Mamaw and Papaw Rouse. Every Thanksgiving Day, Papaw killed hogs. 2 hogs. As a kid, we looked forward to that. The family gathered. It was a big deal to us. I watched, and sometimes I helped. If you want to gut a hog, ask me. Mamaw we'd take trimmings and grind the sausage, and she'd make sausages and fry them and can them. Papa would take the hams, trim them, take them in the smokehouse, lay them out, and he had a big bag of salt, and he would cover those things with a thick layer of salt. I mean, not just sprinkle it on, he put it on, and he rubbed it in, and he'd rub those hams for a good while. And now I understand that that salt acted as a preservative. It kept the hams from spoiling and rotting, becoming putrid and smelly. He applied salt, and later he smoked them some. See, one thing about conversation in marriage, do you use words that are putrid, ugly, stinky, or do you use words that preserve and cure? I think that's very important. If you want progress in your marriage, you have to talk openly and honestly. I believe generally that women are better at this than men. We have different communication needs. I've read that a little girl, when she's born, develops linguistic skills much faster and much more proficiently than a little boy. The fact is, freely than men. The average man speaks 20,000 words a day. The average woman speaks about 30,000 words a day. The man gets home at the end of the day and he only has 50 words left. And you know that he's going to TV and computer his way through the evening. But she has 12,000 words left. And she wants to talk. She's dying to talk. That difference can create great frustration in marriage. We have to learn to communicate in a significant way. So I want to ask you, just take that little page, and on a scale of 1 to 10, how's the communication level in your marriage? If it's very minimal, if all you talk about is the functional stuff, changing the oil in the car, getting the kids to music lessons and so on, if it's at a functional level, give yourself a 1 or 2. If you say, well, Jerry, sometimes we're on the same wavelength, you can maybe give yourself a 4 or 5. But if you can say, you know, we really communicate at a deep level. We plan to talk together. I've learned through the years when Betty says to me, honey, let's go for a walk. It's not about the walk. It's about the talk. That's her signal that she has something to say. And I need to zip my lip and listen and empathize and hear her. That's good communication. So that's number 1. Number 2, I want to call this one good manners. Ephesians 4:2, I love this. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient other in love. That is, be considerate. Consideration simply means that you pay attention to what the other person says. You show common courtesy. You treat people with respect. Consideration means you go out and bring in the groceries even if it's the 4th quarter. Consideration means if you're in a hurry and she's not, let her get both legs in the car before you back out of the driveway. Common courtesies are not so common anymore. I don't want to overly generalize, but I'm reminded often that we live in a rude society. I don't want to contribute to it. Certainly not in my marriage. It's amazing how quickly some common courtesies can diminish or vanish once we're married. We're very considerate when we're dating, but once we're married, that consideration can gradually erode. Here's a progression that can happen in the first 5 years of marriage. If your wife has a bad cold, the first year you say, baby darling, I'm worried about that little sniffle you have. I've called the paramedics and they're going to take you in and have you checked over. I know you don't like hospital food, so I'm going to bring you your meals. The second year, sweetheart, I don't like the sound of that cough. I've arranged for Dr. Wilson to make a house call. I'll tuck you in. The third year, you look like you've got a fever. Why don't you drive yourself down to the clinic and get some medicine? I'll watch the kids. The fourth year, look, be sensible. After you've fed and bathed the kids and washed the dishes, you really ought to go to bed. And the fifth year, for Pete's sake, would you stop coughing? I can't hear the TV. You sound like a barking dog. James chapter 3 says, consideration is a mark of wisdom. When I'm inconsiderate with my spouse, I'm unintentionally creating distance between us. So here's the question. Do you practice good manners? I'm not saying with perfection, but do you practice good manners in your marriage? Is that even something on your agenda? It ought to be. Why should I be courteous and mannerly with others and not with the one person that I love more than anybody else in the world? Practicing good manners. Some years ago, when we lived in St. Paul, Minnesota, one winter day, it was cold, snowing, the wind was blowing, and I was downtown. I was going into a department store. I was bundled up, and I had my head tucked down against the wind. And as I walked up to the big brass handle on the door, I just was aware of the fact that somebody was behind me. Somebody had walked up. And without even thinking, I just pulled the door open. I stepped aside and let that person go in. This was I think back in that day they called them young, upwardly mobile professionals. It was a young lady. And she walked up and she looked at me rather haughtily and said, "You don't have to open the door for me because I'm a woman." Now, I don't usually, but I'm telling you, the Spirit filled me. Met me right there. And I said, "Ma'am, I didn't open it for you because you're a woman. I would have opened it for an insecure man too." Well, she gave me a look that could kill, and she turned and laid rubber down the aisle. Good manners. Apply that as fully as you can in your marriage. If you're considerate, that is, if you're thoughtful and kind and gentle when you're in a good mood, give yourself a 3 or 4. If you help your mate only when they ask for it, maybe a 5 or 6. But if you go out of your way to lighten your partner's load, then give yourself a higher score. That's a wonderful thing. The third word is compromise. A real mark of love. You know the chapter in 1 Corinthians 13, a description of love. There's a phrase that says, "Love does not demand its own way." Let that sink in. Love does not demand its own way. So if you're one of those my way or the highway kind of people, I want you to listen. The unloving thing to do is to try to change your mate. In premarital counseling through the years, I love to talk to an engaged couple about the whole matter of acceptance. I know you'll change. You'll be different a year from now. But if you don't change an ounce, if he still has the bad habits, if she still shows traits, if you don't change an ounce, are you happy to commit yourself to a lifetime of marriage together? You see what that does? That acceptance means that you're free to change and grow because you want to, not because you have to. But if you're trying to change your mate, and that comes across in a conditional way, I want to tell you very gently, stop it. Stop it right now. Because in doing that, you're damaging your marriage. The loving thing to do is not to demand our own way. Many people at the wedding, while they're saying, "I do," in the back of their mind, they're saying, "I'll redo. I'll straighten him out. I'll get rid of his bad habits. I'll help her to walk a little better in this area." That is a poisonous attitude. I grew up thinking that compromise was a bad thing. Don't compromise. Stand your ground. Don't be swayed by others. Compromise is for yellow-bellied sapsuckers who have no backbone. Now, that's true in sinful areas or moral areas. I'm not talking about compromising on moral issues. We don't compromise on things that are right or wrong, morally or ethically, but we must compromise on things based on personality, preference, daily choices. Love does not demand its own way. The fact of life is you will have conflict in marriage. Every marriage has conflict. There are some issues that you're never going to agree on simply because you're different. Compromise is the real evidence of love. Sometimes you meet in the middle. You're flexible. You yield your rights. You give and take. You learn the art of negotiation. I heard a song years ago by a country group called Diamond Rio. It's a song about two lovers who were far apart. And he said, I'll start walking your way, and you start walking mine. We'll meet in the middle, neath that old Georgia pine. I like this, we gain a lot of ground when we both give a little. Ain't no road too long if you meet in the middle. I believe that. Compromise. I'll come your way. I'll give up some stuff. You come my way. You give up some stuff. We'll meet in the middle. And we will have gained a lot of ground. More marriages die from inflexibility, I believe, than from adultery, alcoholism, or abuse. It's a fact that sometimes in our sinful humanity, we're just plain stubborn. Well, that's not true of me, but I've heard that's true of some of you. We don't want to change. We don't want to negotiate. So now if you're a stubborn type, you know where to mark, a 1 or 2 or 3. If you don't talk about issues that you don't agree on, that's pretty weak as well. If you stay with an issue until you work it out, give yourself an 8. If both of you go the second mile, if you know how to give in and do more than your share, if you know how to meet in the middle, give yourself a 10. You have to compromise. The kind of vacations you take, the way your kids are raised, how you discipline and train them, the way you spend money, how often you make love, how often you see the in-laws, whether or not you ever see the in-laws, where you go on holidays, how you spend your day off. What makes you think you can do anything you want on your day off? It isn't just yours. You're in a family now. Compromise. The fourth thing, I have to hurry. Courtship. Next Sunday night, in fact, after the third sermon next Sunday night at 6:30, we're going to do relationship in this area that sometimes we feel embarrassed about and awkward about, and the Bible's not that way at all. So, if you don't believe me, you read Song of Solomon and Proverbs and so on. It's great. Courtship. Proverbs 5:19 says, get this, let your mate's affection fill you at all times with delight. Ecclesiastes 9 says, live happily with the woman you love through all the meaningless days of the life God has given you. Now, Solomon wrote that. Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines, and he had 1,000 women. It took him over 3 years to make the rounds one time. What a man, huh? But he's basically saying life gets tough, life gets meaningless, life gets bored and difficult, and when that happens, turn to your spouse. Live happily with the woman you love all the days of your life. Physical affection, I believe, is absolutely vital to a satisfying marriage. I read a statement that said, if there were more courting in marriage, there'd be fewer marriages in court. Enjoy life with the partner whom you love. Date your mate. The things you did before she was your wife or he was your husband, do those same things now. Make your relationship a priority. Become best friends. Develop things that you like to do together. Find common ground. It's intentional. Good marriages don't just happen. Find a hobby that you both like to do. Find a recreation. Marriages are built on shared relationships. Have you ever noticed that the longer you're married, the more you share the chores and the less you share the joys? Now think about that for a minute. I don't want that to be true of me. The more you share, the longer you're married, the more you share the chores and the less you share the joys. You don't have much fun anymore. Life becomes a burden and not a blessing. So rate yourself in terms of, are you actively engaged with your spouse in shared life? The fifth word, this is one of those ho-hum words, it's the word commitment. Sometime I'd like to go into this more. One of the last verses in the Old Testament, this is whipped out a whole lot. I hate divorce, says the Lord, so guard yourself, always remain loyal to your wife. It's kind of a hard teaching, and we need to delve into that sometimes, what the Bible teaches about divorce and remarriage. But let me just say this in passing. If the possibility of divorce is always there in the back of your mind as a potential option, if you whip that big D word out as a threat, you will have great difficulty building a strong, satisfying, lasting marriage. I know there are exceptions, and I won't go into that now. But when the times are tough, when every bone in your body says, I'm not going to take this anymore, I'm out of here. If divorce is an option, you might take it. Commitment is what makes a marriage great. You know what commitment does? That may sound drab and boring, but commitment takes away the insecurity of wondering whether or not your marriage will survive. You're committed. Of course it's going to survive. Commitment removes the fear of the outcome if one of you sins or makes a big, bad, major mistake. When Betty and I got married, we moved to north of Chicago where I started seminary. We were the first ones to leave home. We were young. We were scared to death. We had everything we owned in the smallest and $150 in our pocket. That first year was tough because we had to adjust. We could not run home to Mama and Daddy. We couldn't go back to a parent who would say, now, dear, he's so bad, who would side with us. We had to buckle down and work it out, and God worked in us in that situation. Commitment. The best definition of commitment I've ever heard. Happy for a while until things get worked out. Do you get that? Commitment means being willing to be unhappy for a while until things get worked out. I think that's a very, very good definition. One thing that can work against my sermon is the clock. Okay. One thing that can work against commitment is what is referred to as the myth of incompatibility. Dr. D. James Kennedy, who was for many years the pastor of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church in Fort Lauderdale, and Pastor Richard, didn't he have a sort of a hand in starting the PCA? He was this denomination that we're in. I heard him speak one time, and he spoke about the word incompatibility. He said that's a very unscientific word, but he said here's what it means. When people claim incompatibility, this comes across a little sexist maybe, that usually means there's a problem with his income and with her compatibility. I don't know about that, but you think about that a little bit. A man named Paul Tournier wrote a book years ago, and he said, so-called incompatibility is a myth invented by lawyers in order to plead for divorce. It's likewise just a common excuse people use to cover up their own failings. Misunderstandings and mistakes can be corrected when there's a willingness to do so. I sat in divorce court one time with a person, and in about an hour, the judge granted either 3 or 4 divorces. The picture was usually this: only one party showed up. The 2 attorneys had already worked out the paperwork. They walk up and hand the paperwork to the judge. He takes 3 or 4 minutes and looks through them, and he says, Mrs. Smith, is your marriage irretrievably broken? And she says, yes, Your Honor, it is. And he starts writing, granting the divorce. And I want to stand up and say, irretrievably broken? God is a great retriever. He's a golden retriever. The issue is not incompatibility. The issue is often selfishness and stubbornness and unwilling to change and compromise. Our marriage will become what we're both committed to making. And I have to stop. The final word, and probably the most important of all, is the building block that we most specifically need is that of a Christian foundation. Your attitude should be your attitude toward each other should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. The way you can do these other 5, I think the only way to really succeed is to have Christ in your heart, in your life. You invite Him in. You ask Him to fill you with His presence, His Spirit. You commit your marriage to Christ. He becomes the center of the relationship. If you can imagine an equilateral triangle, but you start out, here's a man and here's a woman. They're on the same plane. They just relate to each other directly. No outside influence. They struggle and so on. But here's the man, here's the woman. Tough life. But when God becomes part of that, when He's the top part and forms the triangle, as the husband seeks God, as the wife seeks God, and as they're spiritually oriented, and as they move that direction toward the Father, you know what happens to them? As they're moving this way, they grow closer together. They're no longer here. They're doing this. And someday, they're going to get right up here, and the Father's going to touch them. That'll be called heaven. And that's where we're headed. That's where we're headed. Evaluate, communicate, forgive, get out the tools, build stronger. Take her hand in yours. Put your arm around his shoulder. Pray together and ask God to help you make it better, better, and better. I don't want to quit, but I'd better. Amen. Well, let me tell you, as you all come, let me tell you one quick word. When I was young, Pastor, we had a little boy about 4 years old,